Does the way we consume history determine the path towards our future? Does the way citizens perceive their history, familial and collective, affect the way they live their lives, make plans for their future, and eventually, build their nations one way or another? Is there truth in any of that, or is it some fancy theoretical nonsense? In reality, people deal with history in a few defined ways, during their childhood, as a subject in some school curriculum, or as a tool during social gatherings, real or virtual, usually for amusement and sometimes to entice patriotism and evoke a sense of collective belonging, or unfortunately, to generate prejudice or worse, hate speech toward the different other. So is dealing with history limited to those scopes, or does it really dictate the way people live their lives, and eventually the way they build up their nations, and ultimately achieve their place on the world stage? Well, obviously, it's complicated. The complexity and importance of dealing with history can be evident in some nations, particularly during the culturally vulnerable period of their ascendancy on the world stage, trying to find themselves a spot amongst the greatest of nations. The issue of how to parlay history is usually dealt with gravely by the ruling class in autocratic regimes, not that it's taken lightly in democratic nations. But in autocracies, how history is perceived among the masses is a subject of utmost national importance. We may appreciate this attitude in the centenary celebrations of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, this year, marking the establishment of the party in 1921. This year's celebration happens just as Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, seeks a new term next year. Xi Jinping has been president of China since 2013. Marking the centenary and preparing for a new presidential term, the CCP leadership has decided to issue a new resolution regarding the history of the party. During the 100-year history of the party, this has been done twice before. Once at the hands of Mao Zedong and the other at the hands of Deng Xiaoping, the two most important leaders in the history of the CCP, even of all modern China. Each time, they employed the new historical narrative as a cultural reference for the country to follow, a vision of the leader for the party and the country. Where they had been in the past and where they want to be in the future. When Mao Zedong wrote the first resolution, it was to entrench his supremacy over the party and dictate the way he perceived the People's Republic of China. When the party resolution was rewritten in 1981 by Deng Xiaoping, the goal was then to redirect China from a conventionally communist country into a hybrid system that adheres to its communist autocratic roots, while incorporating the dynamics of the open capitalistic market. That, of course, was a huge geopolitical and economic gamble for Deng Xiaoping, but it has paid incredibly well. And now the history of the CCP is rewritten for the third time in the 100 years since the inception of the party. The Chinese people as well as international observers are all keen on reading this new document. But the people most affected by the way the history of the CCP is rewritten are the 95 million members of the party, because they would be obliged to read the script and follow it to the letter. The document, or let's say the book, will be about 500 pages long and will go through the history of China, even before the CCP was formed, probably since the 1911 revolution, when the Chinese Empire fell, and the Republic proclaimed. The CCP was formed about a decade later, in 1921. The Chinese Communists, in the beginning, were few and far between, but their cause was immensely invigorated with the success of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, in 1917. The Chinese Communist Party was even formed with the help of members from the Soviet Communist parties in the Far East of Russia. Rapidly, the party grew in size, and its growth provoked an inevitable confrontation with the Kuomintang, eventually escalating into an open civil war that would end with the Communists prevailing, then declaring the People's Republic in 1949. People privy to the new resolution of the CCP say that a quarter of it would be dedicated to Xi Jinping's years of rule and his pivotal role in raising China to its current international status as a world power, and how, through his guidance, China could finally stand to the United States and the whole Western Bloc. It also delves into how the Chinese army has been renovated and strengthened, and how technology has been deployed in every section of the Chinese society. and how the logistics and transportation services have become so advanced to a degree that surpasses the whole West. People who have read through the new history of the CCP also say that the book or the document places Xi Jinping as an equal in modern Chinese history to Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, the party's, even modern China's most preeminent leaders. Cadres within the CCP say that the president is particularly concerned with the way history is told in China, especially to the younger generation, including children in schools. The president wants all the Chinese people to be taught history in a uniform, streamlined manner, just the government-accredited history. No one should ever be exposed to anything other than the official or national narrative. Even a new set of laws are expected to be issued to criminalize any form of criticism of any historical patriotic figure or even the new national Chinese narrative. But why go to those terrible lengths of legislation? Because it's Xi Jinping's desire and of the leadership of the CCP, who nowadays have become a mirror image of the president, to fully homogenize the Chinese people. They think that people of any society, small or big, would eventually have different ideas and perspectives of life when they are informed of their history through different, potentially conflicting narratives. And sooner or later, those conflicting perspectives would nudge them into following disparate political parties. And each one of these parties would strive to push the country into a particular direction, according to the sets of beliefs and ideologies that this party believes in. And in those countries, whose politicians and parties have differing visions for a country's future, would invariably galvanize their followers, pushing the whole society into a permanent state of strife. The country would eventually find itself in a state of protracted pause. Internally, it would cease to grow, and externally it won't be able to challenge its competitors and enemies. And of course, everyone can see this very scenario unraveling in the United States. The political and ideological differences have turned into societal strife and are hampering the nation's vital political legislations. Like Joe Biden's ambitious plans to upgrade the American infrastructure and the social services. Observers of the current American deadlock could easily justify the Chinese fears. Because indeed, there is a serious ideological rift between the two main American parties, even within the same party, whether the Republican or the Democratic Party. Each group perceives the future of the U.S. in a particular light, and over the past 12 years, this has distracted the Americans from their real domestic needs and overseas challenges. That's why Xi Jinping and those convinced with his vision, see the urgency for the unification of the historical narrative taught to children in schools and the population at large. All children need to be taught one single curriculum and the grown-ups are to be exposed to a single source of news. Eventually, over the years and generations, all Chinese people will think in a uniform, predictable manner and hopefully, be easily convinced by the ideas and plans concocted by the government. And it doesn't stop there. The Chinese government intends to interfere in the upbringing process of children, even at home. The Chinese government has issued a series of laws regarding how children deal with their gadgets at home, allocating each child a limited amount of time per week to engage in online games, whether on their mobile devices or consoles. Presumably, it's to limit the harmful effects of prolonged gaming on children. But more fundamentally, observers believe that this policy intends to decrease the exposure of the Chinese kids to Western ideals which are prevalent throughout the gaming industry. They want to isolate the Chinese children and the younger generation from the Western style and way of thinking. To keep the Chinese citizens ensnared by the historical and social narrative provided exclusively by the government. Leadership in the CCP defend all these policies, on the pretense that it's to preserve the gains of the Chinese nation during the past 40 years. But, this viewpoint has its detractors. Critics say that Xi Jinping actually is following this policy of cultural coercion by the unification of narrative, not to truly unify the Chinese people and to preserve their gains, but rather for his own sake, to emphasize his position in history books, like the greats who came before him. They say that Xi Jinping wants to immortalize himself in the minds of contemporary and future Chinese generations alike. He wants to become holy in the Chinese consciousness, a godlike figure. somebody to whom the Chinese people always feel grateful. And that's an ultimate goal that leaders in autocratic regimes seek almost religiously. Dictators in modern and ancient history, ranging from Augustus to Adolf Hitler, were always keen on keeping alive the message that their people owe them a lot. Hitler's greatest pleasure came, not from his invasions throughout Europe, but the German people's gratitude towards him. Attributing the greatness and success of the German nation to him only. But despite the truths in this critical point of view, the Chinese government has been marching towards this increasing autocracy in a manner that is neither too oppressive nor chaotic, as some critics may say in the West. Actually, each new law or directive goes through extensive research before it's executed via the effective, highly functional Chinese bureaucratic system that implements technology in an amazingly efficient way, without crushing the working class or the lower classes. On the contrary, there has always been a great governmental concern with directly engaging the lower rungs of the society, helping them out of the crises, and providing social services consistently. The efficiency of the social services and the economic stability provided by the regime have helped propel the popularity of the president. Xi Jinping is indeed popular and beloved by people across all social strata in China. That's why his increasingly coercive, social, and cultural policies are accepted without much grumbling. That's it for today. If you'd like to correct or add to the information in this episode, feel free to write down your opinion in the comments section. Also, if you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a like and share it on your social media platform. Thank you and see you next time. Goodbye.